Hey guys, today we're going to say a few words about the KZ ZSNs. A couple weeks ago I received both the ZSNs and the ZSN Pros, and immediately took a liking to the ZSN Pros because they are effortless to wear. I mean, you don't say it too often, but they really are very comfortable to wear in a $20 earphone. So I use those most of the week and kind of felt like I didn't quite give the regular ZSNs a fair shake. So today I just kind of wanted to run through a lot of the characteristics and first impression that I had about the ZSNs. So first, as you can see, the fit and finish is quite similar to the ZSN Pros. You still have a metal backplate, metal nozzle. Cable is pretty much the same on both. The more I use the cable, kind of the less I like it because it just has a tendency to be very light and tangle up. So unfortunately KZ is using it on a lot of their earphones right now, but not too bad. So the packaging itself is very standard, looks just like most of the other KZ earphones. Those are the specs. So, as I mentioned, my big issue with the ZSNs are they're not quite as comfortable as the ZSN Pros. And for me, that kind of comes down to sound isolation as well, right? These don't quite fit as well. They don't quite isolate as much sound, exterior sound, as much as the ZSN Pros, for me anyway. So, it's kind of an average. It says that they'll block, I think, anything up to 26 decibels, but I don't know, probably not for me. I mean, I definitely heard voices and other sounds coming while I was running through my music. Second, not really an issue, but difference between the ZSN and the ZSN Pros, the soundstage isn't quite the same. I mean, the ZSN the soundstage is pretty much dead center in your head, quite narrow, not high, not wide. It's kind of right there in a big ball in your head. And that sort of presents a lack of clarity among instruments, I guess you can say. It's not, the music isn't, it's hard to say, it's not muddled, but it becomes a little harder to differentiate when there's a vocal and lots of instruments and they're all appearing to come from the same point in space. And for me, I sort of like vocal music, and that became a little bit of an issue with these pairs versus the ZSN Pros, which I had a much better time with vocal heavy music. So let's kind of get into some of the more characteristics of these guys and my impressions on kind of a playlist that I was running through. So on the low side, on the bass, it's a lot of mid-range bass. Not really going to find too much sub bass on these guys anyway. Not a horrible. I mean, it's $20 pair, so you can't really expect it to do everything in the world, but it definitely thumps you in the head. The bass, it's not muddy, it's not wild, it's not overwhelming, it's very controlled, very much mid-range, but at the same time it kind of thumps you. So when you look at something like Peter Gabriel's Down to Earth, sounds great. I mean, it probably sounds better on the ZSNs than my ZSN Pros, just because there's just a little more thump to the bass. Same thing, Makaba by Jane, from the Levi's commercial, in case you never heard of that one. Same thing, it's got a really nice bass sound to it. Promises by Calvin Harris, yeah, kind of there too, but on the mid-range, this is kind of where I think it goes a little different than the ZSN Pros, and I really like the ZSN Pros mid. And I think a lot of people say that the ZSN and the ZSN Pros are the same sound signature, and probably the shape is probably the same, but listening to them back and forth, I wouldn't say they're the same. And there's definitely, maybe it's just my choice of music, but definitely a difference. And it sort of comes out in the mids and the highs when you start listening to people's voices and kind of prominent voices. And perhaps it's the soundstage as well, is kind of everything, got voices and instruments all in that mid range. It becomes not a real muddle, but it's a little more challenging to listen to the very fine details of a voice, like, Sam Smith in Promises, or Sia has a very distinctive voice. And on these ZSNs, I sort of had it's not a problem, it's just that if you go back and forth between the regulars and the pros, there's a real kind of, not a lack of detail, but there's more detail on the pros than there is in the regular ZSNs. On the high side, the treble side, I have probably a bigger problem with these than the ZSN Pros. It becomes difficult to listen to these for an extended period of time when you're listening to, something like the beginning to Breaking a Sweat by Skrillex. It's a lot of treble. It's kind of pounding your head, and it's sort of flat. It's I find it kind of fatiguing. And if you don't have sort of a heavy bass to counterbalance all that treble, I kind of had problems with it. It's not bad. It's just, it sounds better in the ZSN Pro than it does in the ZSN. Not too much on the low side and the high side of the treble either, but it's just kind of all smacked right down there in the lower treble. So I definitely prefer the ZSN Pros, especially Hurt by Johnny Cash is another one where Johnny Cash has a super distinctive voice, and you listen to it and it almost sounds thin, right? I love Johnny Cash's voice, and there's kind of a deepness to it that doesn't quite come through on the ZSNs, that really does on the ZSN Pros. It's kind of really good to listen to on the ZSN Pros, but on the ZSNs, didn't really work for me. And then, Work by Rihanna is another one where there's some distortion right in the middle of it. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there as to why, if it's a complexity thing or it's a speed. There's definitely more distortion on the ZSNs than there are on the ZSN Pros. But other songs by Rihanna, not too bad. That one I happened to kind of run across and said, oh, that's doesn't really sound as good as it really should. So, in general, I think I like the ZSNs. I didn't like them so much on the music that I was listening to, but I think there actually is just more bass on the ZSNs than there is on the ZSN Pros, which, again, people don't really, no one else seems to have that opinion, but, side by side, going back and forth, I think Peter Gabriel's Down to Earth definitely sounded better on the ZSNs, just because there's kind of more thump to the bass. You're still not going to get, a lot of sub bass, but definitely more thump on the ZSNs than the ZSN Pros. And the ZSN Pros, I think I would take it one step further and say it's even more controlled bass than the ZSNs, which it's not, I wouldn't say that there's, a lack of bass, but there's just not as much as there is on the ZSNs. So if that's kind of your thing, where I sort of gravitated towards Sia and Johnny Cash and Calvin Harris, because those sound amazing on the ZSN Pros. If you take the other types of music more, like I do a lot of EDM music, and if that's your thing, then you probably might prefer the ZSNs just for the low end than the ZSN Pros. I'm kind of a toss-up. I think I would grab one over the other one depending on what type of music I was listening to, and lately I just happened to be in the strong vocal range, so I was gravitating towards the ZSN Pros all week. But overall they're not quite the same. I wouldn't lump them in the same category of, I wouldn't interchangeably use them over any range of music that I would want to listen to. But if you know that the ZSNs have a heavily low end, then choose those for that day. Otherwise, go with another choice. So not good, not bad, just different as far as I'm concerned from the ZSN Pros. So thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.